Are you a bird brain? Well, in today's video, you're going to find out. We've often made fun of this concept of the bird brain, and some people must be very stupid. They have a brain the size of a bird. Uh, Here's a picture from yesterday. Uh, my son actually saw a bird outside their balcony, and the bird was looking at a mirror and talking to the mirror. So obviously, the bird thought that the mirror was somebody else or some other bird. But interesting enough, he was conversing with the bird. And I suppose the pressing question is, if you're interested in how consciousness works, is to what degree is the bird simply yelling at the other bird because it sees the other bird, or to what degree does it have an awareness that the other bird is there, and to what degree does it want to communicate with the other bird? Fascinatingly, some recent research has put some perspectives on this, and it turns out that bird brains are not so small after all, that they actually have some degree of consciousness. So let's take a look at the article.
Okay, so we have an article here by sciencealert.com. Crows are capable of conscious thought. Scientists demonstrate this for the first time. Now, I suppose people have been thinking that animals are just automatons or something. I do remember some years ago near Christmas, I was driving my car, and suddenly a goose, a week before Christmas, a goose ran across my car. It tried to fly, but I don't think gooses can fly because it got up about 2 feet and then kind of flopped down again and then hit my windscreen. So there's a big bird bouncing off the windscreen. And for a fraction of a second, to see the eye of the goose, and I'm pretty sure it was fear I was seeing in the eye of that goose. And then he flopped off the car and kind of ran off across the road. So I take it he was escaping slaughter, which would definitely suggest a level of subjective awareness that he was aware that he was about to be slaughtered. I mean, let's take a look at this article here. So they have here, right, let's have a look what they're saying. He says that they have subjective experiences. This is called primary or sensory consciousness, and has previously been demonstrated in primates, which means we now have to rethink how we think about consciousness arises. This result of our study opens up a new way of looking at the evolution of awareness and its neurobiological biological constraints, says animal physiologist Andreas Neider of the University of Tübingen. Consciousness is difficult to pin down on animals that don't speak, obviously. Primary consciousness, the most basic form of consciousness as we categorize it, awareness of perceiving the world in the present and the immediate past and the future. Primary has been associated with the primate cerebral cortex, a complex layered region of the mammalian brain. Okay, so mammalian brain is that part of, the part of our brain that allows us to drive cars and do things without thinking too much about it. But bird brains are structured quite differently from primate brains. Okay, basically they're smooth, and primate brains like ours are wrinkled. So even though they're smart, question remained over whether they could cross the line into conscious thought. So here's the experiment. Let's take a look here at the experiment. Okay, so what they did was they put a chip into each of the heads of a few birds, and they saw how they reacted to visual stimuli. They were showing screens on which lights were displayed. If the crow saw the lights, they were to move their heads to show that, yes, they had something. Most of the lights were clear and unambiguous, easy to see. But some of the lights were harder to spot, brief and faint. For these, the two crows responded seeing the signals and sometimes did not. This is where subjective sensory experience enters the picture. For the experiment, each of the crows, there's two crows, was shown roughly 20,000 signals, spread out across dozens of sessions. Meanwhile, electrodes implanted in the brain recorded the neural activity. When the crow recorded a yes response to seeing this visual stimuli, neuronal activity was recorded in the interval between seeing the light and delivering the answer. When the answer was no, the elevated neuronal activity was not seen. This connection was so reliable that it was possible to predict the crow's response based on brain activity. So in other words, you could try and train the crow to do something, but whether it did it or not, you'd actually be able to see via the electrode the neuronal activity. And so they were able to see that there was a variance in what the crows were seeing, or what they were not. So in other words, an objective reality of the light, but what's the crow seeing? Nerve cells that represent visual input without subjective components are expected to respond in the same way to visual stimuli of constant intensity. Our results, however, conclusively show that nerve cells at higher processing levels of the crow's brain are influenced by subjective experiences, or more precisely, uh, uh, reproduce subjective experiences. The results confirm that subjective experiences are not exclusive to the primate brain. So it's not just primates that are self-aware. So the idea that just us and monkeys, we're intelligent monkeys, so us and monkeys are self-aware, but other creatures aren't. And of course, that kind of allows people to do things like kill pigs, chickens, cows, and so on for meat, because they're really dumb. I've never thought that, but this is scientific proof that awareness of some sort is there, certainly in crows anyway. And in fact, the second study finds that the smoothness of bird brains is not indicative at all of lack of complexity. So in other words, the whole wrinkle thing is not a big deal. When you think about it logically, it makes sense, because the top of your brain being wrinkled adds a few percent surface area, not that much. Our brains are processing a lot in a small amount of space. Okay, so they were using a 3D polarized light. They found that cerebral architecture of both birds is strikingly similar to the cerebral architecture of mammals. And this adds a little evolutionary thought, you see. It says here, it's possible that similar cognitive abilities evolved independently in both birds and mammals, a phenomenon known as convergent evolution. But it's also possible that our brains are more closely related than their differences can suggest. Our findings suggest that it's likely that an ancient microcircuit that already existed in the last common stem amniote might have been evolutionarily conserved and partly modified in birds and animals. In other words, that birds and mammals both have this, what I call like microcircuit, this way that the brain is designed, okay? So if you go look back from an evolutionary point of view, we have, you know, at some point in time long ago, okay, birds are different than mammals, but at some point in time there will be common ancestors. So let's have a look at this. The last common ancestor, humans and crows, lived 320 million years ago. It is possible that consciousness of perception arose back then and has been passed down ever since. In any case, the capability of conscious experience can be realized in differently structured brains and independently of the cerebral cortex. So you don't have to have higher thinking to have some kind of self-awareness. Now, they're not saying that they're thinking, well, I'm going to do it tomorrow, but there's some kind of subjective awareness. This means that primary consciousness can be far more common across birds and mammals than realized. If this proves true, the next and possibly more fascinating question is, do these animals also possess secondary consciousness? Are they aware that they are aware? Okay, so there's a lot of interesting questions that are raised there. And I suppose I think it's obvious. I thought it's obvious that animals are aware. Most people, a lot of people have a dog, for example, or a cat, and they certainly feel that the dog or cat are aware. But I mean, something like a crow or a bird will be relatively, we would think, less well evolved than, say, a dog or a cat. I think it's obvious that all creatures are aware to some degree, and certainly they have an instinct to survive, and they feel fear, and they probably feel some kind of relief, etc. I suppose the thing is, are they aware of that? So, of course, we have questions we can ask is, okay, the crow seems to have some subjective awareness. There's a variance in what it perceives, but is it aware that it's aware? Does it have some self-identity? And this is very questionable, and more than likely not. It's hard to know. But I suppose the big thing is that at least this proves that, at least in crows, that they are aware of stuff happening. So this idea of an animal or a bird or whatever being simply some automaton that's kind of thrown out of water scientifically, I think intuitively we all know it, it's obvious, but it's scientifically thrown it out of water. And I would say pretty much the vast majority of creatures have some or other level of consciousness. Like if you try and kill them, they're not happy about it. And there's an awareness of that. So, but secondary consciousness is another question, of course. Are they aware that they're aware? Probably one would imagine not so. From the point of view that if you look at, say, dogs in the street or cows, for example, in the fields, like if they were aware that this is it, I'm in this situation, this is my lot, It's like in those fantasy stories where they turn somebody into a donkey or something. Like in Shrek, the guy did he get turned into a donkey? I don't know. Some different things people get turned into donkeys. So on. Like you'll be incredibly unhappy in your human consciousness to be a donkey. But one presumes that the donkey isn't really aware, and that these creatures, they are aware to some degree of pain, pleasure, uh, but they're not really thinking about it. They're not rationalizing it. And I don't think anybody here is saying that animals or birds are rationalizing things, but they seem to have some kind of subjective awareness, which is varying. Um, so regarding bird brains, I suppose, yeah, obviously our brains are quite different from the brain of a bird. By the same token, even a bird has consciousness. And often we think of ourselves as very clever, very advanced, and so on. But consciousness seems to be present. Certainly, there's a scientific proof that consciousness is present in birds to some degree, and that consciousness is probably present in most creatures to some degree. Certainly, higher level creatures like animals and birds and so on. And that raises a lot of questions about whether you should be cruel. I mean, I don't think anybody would really think you should be cruel to animals, but how much do they suffer when you, say, kill them, for example? Should we slaughter animals? Is it humane, no matter which way you do it? You know, and some creatures do seem to have more awareness of this than others. But it does appear that we all have some kind of consciousness. The last thing I'd like to just note here, and this is what why I made this video, might think it's relevant, is it seems to me that a lot of the problems that we have as human beings is because the way our minds have evolved along with our brains, and a lot of the processes that develop our minds go back thousands of years. So for example, the reason why we suffer from stress so much is because of the fight or flight response, which is a kind of animalistic response. It also means that we have a tendency to not face up to things that we should face up to, and it also means that we can be aggressive when there's no need to be aggressive. Okay? So I think it's an interesting thing to look at these areas, because human beings are obviously stuck between kind of two opposites. We got the animalistic side, and we got the higher level side, and we all want to go to something higher, but our animalistic side, that basically we're an intelligent ape. And I suppose the thing is, are we an intelligent ape? Or are we a dumb something else? Are we more than that? Can we be more than just an intelligent ape? And that's really what the whole striving for in society and life is, to strive for something more. And humanity tends to be somewhat inhumane. There's constant, to some degree, there's evolution going on. To some degree, the world's still pretty barbaric because of all these animalistic instincts. So how do we deal with the instinctual self and the higher self? And the basic problem is our brain is wired a certain way. So what I like about looking at, say, bird brains, for example, and we always say your bird brain is you're stupid, but actually, birds aren't that stupid. And when we look at things like birds, you look at things like reptiles, etc., they're part of our mind. Our brain is structured that way, and our mind is developed upon this primitive side. And I think we have to understand more about how these creatures think and process, because they're part of how we think and process things. And it's something to think about, to consider as we strive to something higher. And also when we look at the nature of consciousness, and that we have a similarity to the creatures around us, because there's two extremes. One extreme is this limiting ourselves to think we're just an intelligent ape, that we can do something more. And the other is thinking that we're so great, and animals and stuff, we can just kill them all, do what we want, because really they're dumb. They don't have, birds have an existence. I pretty well think that cows and dogs, and they have a subjective existence. Maybe they don't self-reflect the way we do, but they do have a consciousness. And it's interesting to think about the nature of consciousness and the nature of their consciousness, and what aspects of the way that they process the world, we also process the world, and how that can hold us back, and how an awareness of that can help us, well, A, be more humane towards animals and birds and so on, but also that we can figure out ways to aspire to something better. We take psychology, really, as we know it, modern psychology dates back to the very late 19th century. That's under 20, 130 years. There's so much more that we can do to go forward. So are you a bird brain? Well, slightly, a little bit. There seems to be some similarities there somewhere. And maybe birds are more ahead than you think. And maybe we're more connected to the world of mammals and birds and so on than we realize. And that's something we're considering. If we're thinking about the nature of consciousness, we should have some awareness of our biological roots.